In Renaissance Italy, two families were fighting for control of the most powerful cities, banks, armies, and political alliances in Europe. One was the Medici, the other was the Borgias. But while the Medici built their empire with money and banking, the Borgias found something even more powerful: the papacy. And once they had it, the Medici realized they were no longer dealing with a rival family. They were dealing with a family that could excommunicate kings, raise armies in the name of God, crown or uncrown rulers, and redraw the political map of Italy with a single papal decree. This is the story of how one family terrified the other, not with gold, not with trade, but with the most dangerous weapon in the medieval world: absolute spiritual authority, backed by military force. Two families, two kinds of power. To understand why the Medici feared the Borgias, you first need to understand what Italy looked like in the 15th century. Because it was not one country. It was a patchwork of city-states, republics, duchies, and kingdoms, each one competing for land, trade routes, and survival. There was no national army, no central government, no single ruler. Instead, there were five major powers. Venice, a maritime republic that had grown rich from Eastern trade and controlled a growing empire in the Mediterranean. Florence, a republic ruled by banking families. Its wealth came from cloth manufacturing, international finance, and the golden coins called florins that had become the preferred currency across Europe. Milan, an industrial giant in the north, controlled by the Visconti and later the Sforza dukes, who governed through a mixture of cunning politics and brute force. Naples, the great southern kingdom, feudal and unstable, ruled by the House of Aragon, where kings thought nothing of torturing enemies and strangling guests at their own dinner tables. And Rome, not a commercial power, not a military stronghold, but something arguably more dangerous than any of them. Because Rome had the Pope. And the Pope controlled not just the spiritual life of all Western Christendom, but an enormous network of political alliances, territorial claims, taxation rights, and the ability to place or remove rulers across the continent. Whoever controlled the papacy could shape the fate of every other power in Italy. The Medici understood this better than anyone. For generations, they had worked to keep close ties with Rome. The Medici Bank handled Vatican finances. Their loans funded papal wars. Their political connections stretched from Florence to the papal court and back again. They even arranged marriages between their family and papal relatives. It was a relationship built on mutual benefit. But then something happened that the Medici did not expect. A new family arrived in Rome, a family from Spain, and they did not want to be the Pope's bankers. They wanted to be the Pope. The Borgias come to Rome. The Borgias were not Roman. They were not even Italian. They came from Jattiva, a town near Valencia in the Kingdom of Aragon. Their original name was Borgia. When they crossed into Italy, it became Borgia. The family's rise began with a man named Alonso de Borja. He was a scholar, a lawyer, and a trusted servant of King Alfonso V of Aragon. For decades, he worked quietly in the background, managing royal affairs, reforming judicial systems, and building a reputation for competence and integrity. In 1444, Pope Eugenius IV rewarded him with a cardinal's hat. Alonso moved to Rome the following year. He was already in his late 60s. No one expected him to become Pope. But in 1455, when the cardinals gathered to choose a successor to Nicholas V, they found themselves deadlocked. The two most powerful Roman families, the Orsini and the Colonna, had been at each other's throats for generations. Neither would allow the other's candidate to win, Italian cardinals could not unite. French cardinals blocked any candidate they considered too foreign. Greek scholars were dismissed for wearing beards. Days passed. Tempers rose. And then, exhausted and desperate for a compromise, the cardinals turned to the one man nobody had a reason to oppose: the elderly Spaniard in declining health. Alonso de Borja became Pope Calixtus III. The cardinals congratulated themselves. They assumed they had chosen a man too old and too frail to change anything, a placeholder, a pope who would reign passively and die quickly. They were wrong. Calixtus immediately launched an aggressive campaign against the Ottoman Turks. He sold papal treasures. He stripped gold bindings from Vatican books. He turned Rome's waterfront into a shipyard and began building a fleet. He slashed Vatican spending and redirected nearly everything toward war. But the decision that would echo through the decades had nothing to do with the Turks. It had to do with family. Calixtus appointed his young nephew Rodrigo Borgia as vice-chancellor of the church, one of the most powerful positions in the entire papal government. Another nephew, Pedro Luis, was made captain general of the papal army and governor of Castel Sant'Angelo, the fortress that controlled Rome itself. The Borgias had arrived, and they had no intention of leaving. Rodrigo, the long apprenticeship. When Calixtus III died in 1458, the Romans rioted. They hated the Spanish interlopers. Borgias were attacked in the streets. Pedro Luis fled Rome and died shortly after. But Rodrigo survived. He was 27 years old. He had the title of vice-chancellor. He had wealth, connections, and something far more valuable: the political instincts of a man who understood that in Rome, survival depended not on fighting, but on knowing when to stay quiet. And so, for the next 34 years, Rodrigo Borgia served 5 consecutive popes. He watched each one struggle with the same problems: civil wars, financial crises, foreign threats, and the endless feuding of Roman barons. He observed their mistakes. He catalogued their weaknesses. He noted what worked and what did not. He survived the papacy of Pius II, who tried and failed to launch a crusade. He survived Paul II, who clashed with humanist scholars and died amid rumors of poisoning. He survived Sixtus IV, the pope who nearly destroyed Italy. Sixtus was the one who tried to break the Medici. In 1478, Sixtus and his nephew Girolamo Riario backed a conspiracy to murder Lorenzo de' Medici and his brother Giuliano during Mass in the Cathedral of Florence. It was called the Papacy conspiracy, after the rival banking family that carried out the attack. Giuliano was stabbed to death at the altar. Lorenzo escaped, with a knife wound in his neck. The plot failed catastrophically. The assassins were hanged in the public square within hours. Florence erupted in fury. The Pope's own Archbishop of Pisa was among those strung up from the windows of the Palazzo della Signoria. Sixtus responded by excommunicating Lorenzo. Then he excommunicated all of Florence. Then he declared war. The entire Italian peninsula descended into chaos. Through all of this, Rodrigo Borgia kept his head down. He did not take sides. He did not make enemies. He attended to his duties, managed Vatican administration, and waited. The Medici, for their part, survived the Papacy conspiracy and came out stronger. Lorenzo earned the name the Magnificent. He became the most important political operator in Italy, the man who kept the balance of power from collapsing entirely. But Lorenzo's health was failing, and in April 1492, aged only 43, he died. 3 months later, Pope Innocent VIII followed him to the grave. The 2 men who had done the most to keep Italy stable were gone, and in the power vacuum that followed, Rodrigo Borgia finally made his move. The Conclave of 1492. In August 1492, the same month Columbus sailed west from Spain, 23 cardinals sealed themselves inside the Sistine Chapel to choose a new pope. The conclave was immediately consumed by the same forces that had paralyzed every papal election for decades. Two factions squared off against each other. On one side stood Cardinal Giuliano della Rovere, backed by the King of Naples, the King of France, and the Republic of Genoa. France alone reportedly made 200,000 ducats available for bribes. On the other side stood Cardinal Ascanio Sforza, brother of Ludovico Sforza, the strongman who controlled Milan. Neither man could win. Della Rovere could not break through. Sforza could not build a majority. The deadlock was total. And then, quietly, Rodrigo Borgia's tally began to rise. 7 votes, then 8, then more. He had not aligned himself with Naples or Milan. He had not antagonized France or Venice. He was beholden to no one. After 34 years in the Vatican, he had made himself the only candidate that no major power had reason to fear. On August 11th, Rodrigo Borgia was elected Pope Alexander VI. It was said that when King Ferrante of Naples heard the news, he burst into tears, not because the papacy had fallen into the hands of a corrupt man. Ferrante, who had once strangled a guest at his own banquet, was hardly in a position to judge, but because he understood that this new pope would be impossible to control. And Ferrante was right. Alexander VI was not Calixtus. He was not an old man waiting to die. He was 60 years old, in vigorous health, and burning with ambition. The Medici had lost their most important ally when Lorenzo died. Now, with Alexander on the papal throne, they had a new problem. The Borgias were no longer a family operating inside the system. They were the system. The French invasion and the fall of the Medici. Lorenzo de' Medici had left Florence in the hands of his 20-year-old son, Piero. Lorenzo had said with fatherly pride that Piero promised to be the greatest of the Medici. He was catastrophically wrong. Piero would come to be known as Piero the Unfortunate, and the misfortunes were almost entirely of his own making. In 1494, King Charles VIII of France invaded Italy at the head of a massive army. He had been invited by Ludovico Sforza of Milan, who feared an alliance between Naples, Florence, and Rome, and thought a French invasion might tip the balance back in his favor. It was one of the worst miscalculations in Italian history. Charles's army crossed the Alps and marched south almost unopposed. Italian states that had spent centuries fighting each other with condottieri and siege warfare had never seen anything like the French. Their enormous bronze cannons could reduce fortress walls to rubble in hours. Their disciplined infantry cut through Italian resistance like a scythe through wheat. One by one, cities fell, and Piero de' Medici panicked. Instead of negotiating from a position of strength, or even dignity, as his father surely would have done, Piero rode out to meet the French king at Sarzana and prostrated himself completely. He handed over Florence's strategic fortresses. He surrendered the port of Livorno. He gave away the city of Pisa, a possession the Florentines considered essential to their survival. When the citizens of Florence learned what Piero had done, their rage exploded. On November 9th, 1494, Piero de' Medici and his family were expelled from Florence. Generations of Medici dominance ended in a single day. The man who stepped into the vacuum was not a politician or a banker. He was a Dominican friar named Girolamo Savonarola, a fiery preacher who had been condemning the corruption of both the Medici and the Papacy for years. Savonarola turned Florence into a theocratic republic. He organized bonfires of vanities, public burnings of art, books, mirrors, musical instruments, and luxury goods. He sent gangs of boys through the streets to confiscate anything he considered sinful. He pushed for the death penalty for anyone who supported tyranny, meaning anyone who spoke favorably of the Medici. And he openly declared that Pope Alexander VI was illegitimate. This is important, because while the Medici were being humiliated and exiled, while their city was being turned upside down by a fanatic preacher, Pope Alexander VI was watching from Rome. And he was not watching passively. He was building something. Cesare. Alexander VI had a son. His name was Cesare Borgia, and Cesare would become the single most feared man in Italy. He had been made a cardinal at 18, not because he wanted to be one, but because his father needed someone inside the College of Cardinals he could trust absolutely. Cesare hated it. He hated the robes. He hated the rituals. He hated being trapped in an institution, while other men rode at the head of armies. What Cesare wanted was to conquer. In 1498, he became the first man in history to resign from the College of Cardinals. He traveled to France, where Louis XII, who had succeeded Charles VIII, made him Duke of Valentinois and gave him a French bride. He returned to Italy not as a churchman, but as a military commander. And then he began to move. His first targets were the petty tyrants of the Romagna, the region stretching across north-central Italy that technically owed allegiance to Rome, but had been ruled for generations by local warlords who exploited their subjects and ignored papal authority. Cesare took them down one by one. Imola fell. Then Forlì, where he besieged and captured the notorious Caterina Sforza. Then Rimini, Pesaro, Faenza. Each campaign followed the same pattern. Cesare moved fast. He struck without warning. He offered generous terms to towns that surrendered and made examples of those that resisted. And after each conquest, he replaced the old tyrants with efficient administrators who delivered something the Romagna had not experienced in living memory: honest government. The people of the Romagna did not resist him. Many welcomed him. By 1501, Pope Alexander had officially created Cesare, Duke of the Romagna. He was 25 years old, and he was not finished. Why Florence was terrified. This is where the Medici's fear becomes concrete, because Cesare did not stop at the Romagna. He looked west, toward Tuscany, toward Florence. In the spring of 1501, Cesare's army crossed the Apennines and entered Florentine territory. His troops destroyed crops, burned barns, stole livestock, and cut the grain ripening in the fields. The Florentine Republic, still reeling from years of instability after the Medici expulsion and Savonarola's execution, was in no position to stop him. A Florentine diplomat named Biagio Buonaccorsi described the situation inside the city: the greatest disorder, citizens fleeing their homes, appeals made to the King of France, who was too far away to help. Florence negotiated a treaty. They agreed to pay Cesare 36,000 ducats a year, just to leave them alone. Buonaccorsi said the Florentines had signed merely to get Cesare off their backs. But the threat was very real, and then it got worse. In the summer of 1502, Cesare seized the Duchy of Urbino in a lightning campaign that stunned Italy. He moved so fast that Duke Guidobaldo da Montefeltro barely had time to flee in his nightclothes. Within days, Cesare's men were loading the contents of Urbino's famous palace, one of the great art collections of the Renaissance, onto mule trains headed for Borgia fortresses. Then he turned his attention to Florence again. This time, the Republic sent its sharpest mind to deal with him. Niccolò Machiavelli. Machiavelli meets the monster. Machiavelli arrived at Urbino around sundown on June 24, 1502, after a hard ride over the Apennines. He was taken to see Cesare shortly before midnight. What followed was one of the most remarkable encounters in political history. Cesare received his visitors in one of the vast chambers of Urbino's ducal palace. A single candle burned behind him, so that he could see their faces, while his own remained in shadow. He wore his signature black tunic, plain, unadorned, except for the emblem of the Order of Saint Michel that the King of France had placed around his neck. Machiavelli was not a man easily impressed. He would become famous for his cynicism, his detachment, his contempt for most of the powerful men of his day. But Cesare left him nearly speechless. "This lord is truly splendid and magnificent," Machiavelli wrote to Florence. "In the pursuit of glory and territory, he is unceasing and knows neither danger nor fatigue." Cesare told the Florentines he wanted an answer. Was Florence his friend or his enemy? There was no middle ground. He gave them 4 days. Behind the diplomatic language, the threat was unmistakable. Several of Cesare's own captains, men like Vitellozzo Vitelli and Paolo Orsini, were loyal to the exiled Medici. If Cesare wanted to restore the Medici to Florence, he could, and the price of that restoration would be that Florence became a Borgia client state. The Florentine government, following Machiavelli's advice, stalled for time. They sent word back to Cesare that they needed to consult the Pope and the King of France before committing to anything. It worked. When French couriers arrived with orders telling Cesare to leave Florence alone, the immediate threat passed. But the fear did not. All the tyrants of North Italy were afraid of Cesare at this point, one historian later wrote. The Medici, exiled and scattered, watched from a distance. They understood something the rest of Italy was only beginning to grasp. This was no longer about one ambitious duke. This was about a family that controlled the papacy and a military machine at the same time. The Pope provided the money, the legitimacy, and the political cover. Cesare provided the army, the strategy, and the willingness to do whatever it took. Together, they were building something Italy had not seen since the fall of Rome. A centralized state, carved out of the chaos of the Italian peninsula, held together not by feudal tradition or commercial wealth, but by force, administration, and the authority of the church itself. And every other family in Italy, the Medici included, understood that if the Borgias succeeded, there would be no room left for anyone else. The trap at Senigallia. By the autumn of 1502, even Cesare's own captains were afraid of him. A group of his condottieri, the mercenary commanders who led his armies, formed a conspiracy to destroy him. The plotters included Vitellozzo Vitelli, Oliverotto Uffreducci, Paolo Orsini, and Gianpaolo Baglioni, along with the lords of several smaller states. These were not frightened merchants or minor nobles. They were seasoned killers. They commanded real armies. Together, they controlled substantial territories. And for a few weeks, it looked like they might win. Rebellions broke out across Cesare's conquered lands. Urbino fell back into the hands of its former duke. Towns loyal to the old rulers rose up against Borgia garrisons. Some garrisons were slaughtered to the last man. Cesare retreated to his headquarters at Imola. Machiavelli was there with him. And what Machiavelli witnessed over the following weeks would shape his thinking for the rest of his life. Because Cesare did not panic. He did not rage. He did not make desperate moves. He sat in Imola, calm and composed, while his political and military situation appeared to be collapsing around him. What Machiavelli could not see What almost no one could see was that Cesare was playing a longer game. He identified the weakest member of the conspiracy, Paolo Orsini, a man so unstable that his own troops called him Madonna Orsini. Cesare sent secret messages. He offered forgiveness. He promised that the condottieri could return to his payroll with no consequences. One by one, the conspirators lost their nerve. Venice refused to help them. Florence refused to help them. The King of France made it clear he stood with the Borgias. The plotters came crawling back. They agreed to terms. And then, on New Year's Eve, 1502, Cesare invited them to Senigallia. They came. An hour after midnight, on the first day of 1503, Vitellozzo Vitelli and Oliverotto Uffreducci were strangled by Cesare's lieutenant, Miguel de Corella. He used a violin string. Vitelli, it was said, begged to be allowed to live long enough to ask the Pope for an indulgence that would spare him from divine punishment. Oliverotto wept and blamed Vitelli for everything. 3 members of the Orsini family were taken prisoner. Back in Rome, Pope Alexander was filling his dungeons with every Orsini he could find. Machiavelli was in Senigallia when it happened. He approved, not because he was bloodthirsty, but because he had arrived at a conclusion that would define his masterwork, The Prince, that Cesare Borgia, more than anyone else then living, had the vision, the boldness, and the ruthless courage needed to unite Italy. Everyone else in the peninsula arrived at a different conclusion. They were terrified. The Borgias and the Medici, the real threat. For the exiled Medici, the situation was dire. They had been thrown out of Florence in 1494. Their bank was in decline. Their political network had been shredded. And the Borgias were closing in from every direction. To the east, Cesare controlled the entire Romagna. To the south, Pope Alexander controlled Rome and the Papal States. To the north, the King of France, the Borgias' principal ally, controlled Milan. Florence was surrounded. The Medici's fear was not abstract. It was specific and immediate. If Cesare decided to take Florence, there was no one who could stop him. The French might object, but they were busy with their own war in Naples. Venice had its own problems with the Turks, and the Florentine Republic had neither the army nor the political will to resist a full-scale Borgia invasion. Worse still, several of Cesare's most important allies were Medici partisans. The Orsini family had been aligned with the Medici for generations. If the Borgias chose to restore the Medici to Florence, they could, but on Borgia terms. That meant the Medici would return, not as masters of Florence, but as puppets of a Borgia state. Either way, the Medici lost. If the Republic survived, they remained in exile. If the Borgias conquered Florence, the Medici might return, but only as dependents of a family far more powerful and far more dangerous than themselves. The Borgias had something the Medici never had. The Medici had money. The Borgias had the keys to heaven. And they were perfectly willing to use those keys to open the gates of hell. The death that changed everything. In the summer of 1503, Rome was suffocating. The heat was brutal. A fever, probably malaria, swept through the city. People died in great numbers. Cardinals fell ill. Diplomats collapsed. The streets smelled of death. On August 5th, Pope Alexander VI and Cesare both attended a dinner at the country villa of Cardinal Adriano Castellesi. Within days, both were gravely ill. Poison was naturally suspected. Some said Cesare had intended to poison the cardinal and accidentally drank from the wrong flagon. Others said a servant had been bribed. Still others, including Alexander himself, blamed the pestilent air. Whatever the cause, Alexander deteriorated rapidly. On August 12th, he developed a high fever that would not break. On August 16th, he received last rites. On August 18th, 1503, Pope Alexander VI died. He was 72 years old. Cesare was still alive, but barely. He was racked with fever, his skin peeling from his body after being plunged into a bath of ice-cold water. He was lucid enough to send his lieutenant to seize the Vatican treasury before the cardinals could claim it, but he was too sick to ride, too sick to command, too sick to hold together the empire his father had helped him build. And it began to collapse, almost immediately. In Rome, gangs of men marched through the streets shouting, "Down with the odious Catalan," something no one would have dared say, while Alexander was alive. The Orsini returned. The Colonna returned. Cesare's governors were driven from their posts. Cities he had conquered declared independence. Fortresses changed hands. Within weeks, nearly everything the Borgias had built was gone. Julius II, and the end of the Borgias. The new pope was Cardinal Giuliano della Rovere. He took the name Julius II, and his hatred of the Borgias was absolute. Della Rovere had spent 10 years in exile during Alexander's reign. He had tried to organize a French invasion to depose Alexander. He had spent a decade nursing his grievances, waiting for the moment when the Borgia Pope would die and he could finally take the throne. Now that moment had come. Cesare, still recovering from his illness, made a catastrophic miscalculation. He supported della Rovere's candidacy in exchange for promises that his titles and territories would be preserved. Machiavelli was astonished. He could not believe that Cesare would trust a man who had every reason in the world to destroy him. Whoever believes that great men allow new services to erase old injuries, Machiavelli would later write, is deceiving himself. He was right. Julius II had no intention of honoring his promises. Within weeks of his election, he demanded that Cesare surrender his fortresses. When Cesare refused, Julius had him arrested. Cesare was taken to Ostia, then brought back to Rome in chains. There were reports that his spirit had finally broken, that he wept, that he fell to his knees before Guidobaldo da Montefeltro and begged forgiveness for what he had done in Urbino. Machiavelli, who had once called Cesare the most formidable man in Italy, now described him as an angry, broken man, out of his mind, and not knowing what he wanted to do. In early 1504, Cesare was shipped to Spain. He was imprisoned in the castle of Chinchilla, high in the mountains behind Valencia, not far from Jativa, where the Borgia story had begun. He escaped in 1506. He died in battle in 1507, fighting for the King of Navarre. He was 31 years old. What the Medici learned. The Borgias were gone. Their papacy was over. Their duchy had crumbled. Their name had become a synonym for poison, treachery, and ambition. But the Medici had learned something from watching the Borgias that would change their family forever. They learned that money was not enough. Banks could be seized, loans could be repudiated, trade routes could be cut. A family built on commerce, no matter how wealthy, was always one revolution away from exile. But the papacy was different. The papacy could not be overthrown by a mob. It could not be bankrupted by a market collapse. It answered to no king, no emperor, no republic. The Borgias had shown what happened when a family placed one of its own on the throne of St. Peter. And in 1513, just 10 years after Alexander's death, The Medici did exactly that. Giovanni de' Medici, son of Lorenzo the Magnificent, was elected Pope Leo X. It was the single most important moment in Medici history. Not the founding of the bank, not the patronage of Michelangelo or Botticelli, not the political rise of Cosimo or the diplomacy of Lorenzo. The papacy. Because the papacy was what made the Medici untouchable. And they had learned that lesson from the family they feared most. The Borgias had shown the Medici the way, and then they had been destroyed by the very forces they unleashed. That is what made the Borgias so dangerous. Not that they were evil, not that they were corrupt, but that they understood, before anyone else, that in Renaissance Italy, the man who controlled the church controlled everything. The Medici feared the Borgias because the Borgias had figured out the game first. And for a brief, violent, extraordinary decade, they won it.